Thank you, Mr. Hollowbone. It's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship, and it is a great pleasure to follow the Honourable Lady. She and I talked about this before this debate started, so there will be a lot of overlap in our presentations. And I'm glad that she has taken the title and used it to interpret it very widely, because it talks about youth inmates. And that's not just children, that is young adults as well. And I'll come on to say a little bit about that in a minute. Now, the Justice Select Committee, as well as her own Select Committee, did have a look at this some time ago. I have to say it was 2016-17, in the treatment of young adults in the criminal justice system was the title of the report. And we did that because we were concerned about the effectiveness of the treatment of young adults in the justice system. And we looked at the needs, the characteristics, and the effective ways of working with them. And we also went on a visit. This was in the days when select committees could go on international visits, and we went to New York and to Boston. Now, you may have a view that the New York, the American system of governance is much stricter and much tougher than ours. I couldn't disagree more. What we found was a much more liberal approach to the situation, and where children were treated kindly and efficiently, and it had an enormous impact on their rehabilitation. Now, we also interviewed a number of parents of people who had been detained at youth offender institutes, or indeed later at prison. Yes, of course.
I thank the member for giving me. Just before he moves on from the issue of being to the United States, would he agree with me that whereas I fully accept the experience that he encountered on his visit to that part of the United States, given the complexity of the judicial system in the United States of America, there may well be rapid and significant variations from state to state in the United States of America?
I think my honourable friend makes a very good point. But we chose New York because it has some of the toughest people there, some of the toughest criminals there, and it was interesting to see how, in that sort of tough environment, the situation was dealt with. And what we found, as I said, that it was a very liberal approach to it. Now, back here, we interviewed the parents of people who had been to youth offender institutes or into prison. And I have to say that was the feedback we got from that was utterly tragic. The personal circumstances of the individuals there was just had to be heard to be believed. And we have to do all that we can to stop those sort of occurrences occurring again. And in doing this, we were looking at a wide range of ages, from 10 to 24. So it encompasses everything the Honourable Lady was talking about. And one of the things that we found was that men and boys account for a disproportionate number within the criminal justice system who are going through this process. So there is something about men and boys that needs to be tackled and to be tackled seriously. And one of the things that we looked at was the neuroscience that was involved. And neuroscience has become a very trendy subject these days, but it has done a lot of work to look at how the brain develops and how maturity develops within the brain over those periods. And really, the evidence that we heard on that showed that the brain develops over a much longer period, and what we would generally describe as maturity is the last thing to develop in that. The Honourable Lady may have experienced that with some of the children that she used to teach. So I hope it rings a bell with her. And it was also interesting that as people got nearer to 18, their level of risk of reoffending actually increased, not decreased. There was something about reaching that sort of level that created a much more turbulent time for the individuals. Now, how you then impose either solitary confinement or segregation on people when they are in that situation, I think is something that we all ought to look at very, very carefully, because it is not something that immediately jumps out. And in fact, there is a strong evidence. There is strong evidence that the involvement with the criminal justice system actually hinders boys' and men's development. Actually being involved with the criminal justice system hinders it. Now, when we look at the people who are being segregated or are being put into solitary confinement, we need to do a risk assessment of them. Why do we need to do this risk assessment? Because we have stunning evidence. If I can just give a few examples of the stunning evidence. Learning disability amongst young people in the general population is between 2 and 4%. Amongst those that are in custody, it's 23 to 32%. It's an enormous increase. Communications impairment in the majority of people, of young people in the country, is between 5 and 7%. For those in custody, it is 60 to 90%. Almost all of the people there have a communications difficulty. And even those with ADHD, that is 1.7 to 9% amongst the general population, where it goes up to 12%. And autistic spectrum disorder runs at a maximum of 1.2% amongst the general population, which goes up to 15% amongst people in custody. So we are dealing with a group of people who are, by any stretch of the imagination, vulnerable and have a tendency to need that risk assessment in order to assess how they are doing. And I know that it has already been mentioned, but the number of people in youth custody who have already been in statutory care before that is running at 2/3. It's an enormous number. And again, that suggests that we are dealing with a very vulnerable population. Now, one of the places that we also went to as we produced this report was to go to a Young Offenders Institute. And we went to the Young Offenders Institute at Aylesbury. And what we found there was that segregation was used to reduce movements amongst young people. But it was used there, they said, to reduce movements amongst young people when there was a risk of gang violence. And dealing with gangs in that Young Offenders Institute was one of the biggest tasks that the staff there had. And what the young people there said, because we asked them the question of would they like to be in a Young Offenders Institute or in a prison. Many had been in both at the time. And they said that the change in the justice system from going from a youth to an adult institution was like dropping off a cliff face. And I think that that's a very important thing to bear in mind, because that goes back to the treatment of them in being able to look at solitary confinement. Now, we also interviewed, and I have subsequently spoken to Lord Harris of Haringey, who produced a very good review on this situation. He looked at young people detained in cells for a long period. And what he found was that there might be situations where it was to the benefit of the individual young person if they were confined to their cells. There were times when they were being threatened, where it was better to put them in their cells. But if you are going to do that, it needs a risk assessment done of their mental health and of their ability to how they're going to function there. And whatever the Minister says about this, I have to say that my experience, and that of the committee, is that this does not happen routinely enough. And it is a big lack in what goes on in the system. And if I can just quote from one of the witnesses that we interviewed as part of the process, it's Dr. Gooch, who is, I think, at the Birmingham Law School. She says, and I quote, it is decisions that are made about how you use segregation and how you use adjudications, which are the disciplinary hearings within the prison. It is the values that you instill about where the boundaries are and what is appropriate behaviour. When you talk about grip on this situation, it's not about punitiveness. It is understanding when to lock down and when to use your security measures to their full potential. And that sort of understanding of the situation suggests that there needs to be a much greater flexibility in the youth justice system than there is. I just want to pick up one last point in this, and that is the question of purposeful activity, which the Honourable Lady also mentioned. I have a very strong view that we need to instill as much purposeful activity as possible, whether it's in the adult section or in the youth section of the criminal justice system. And in a former Justice Select Committee, I went to a prison in Denmark where the prisoners of actually quite a wide range of ages cooked their own food. The knives, for the safety's sake, were chained to the wall, it is true, but nevertheless, the very fact that they were able to cook their own food had a big impact on their ability to be rehabilitated. And it was a great impression on me, and I know when I came back and mentioned it to the then Secretary of State, he went away with this, and I know that there are prisons where that happens now in the UK. But I think that instilling some purposeful activity into young people, whether that is through education, through skills training, through all of these things, is absolutely essential, and that we need to keep that going if we are to tackle this problem. As I said at the beginning of this section, I understand that the Minister will say that this never happens, and that he's laughing at me now, that this never happens, but when it does happen, there is risk assessment done. All I am saying is that in our experience, that did not happen. It is not commonplace for it to happen all the time in every case. And with the history that I've given of the differences between the mental illnesses that the general population of young people have and those that in prison have, it needs to be.